Big issues, big ideas, global cities.
Good evening. Good evening. I am Ivo Dolder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Chicago and to the 2016 Chicago Forum on Global Cities. This is the century of cities. For the first time in history, more people are living in cities than in rural areas. The explosive urbanization is one of the great driving forces of our world today. By 2050, 3 billion more people will have moved to cities, a rate of growth that is similar to building one London every year for the next 35 years. The Chicago Forum focuses on one particular form of cities, global cities. These cities are the hubs of the new urbanizing world. Their banks and markets finance the global economy. Their corporations shape that economy. Their universities both imagine the future and train the young who will make it happen. Global communications and global fads radiate from global cities. They have the best restaurants, the richest museums, the largest stadiums. They are also the targets for terrorists with global reach, the destination for immigrants seeking better lives, and ground central for global warming. For good or for ill, global cities are where the action is today. So over the next 3 days, we will have a global conversation about these global cities. And we're fortunate to have with us over 60 speakers, some 600 delegates from over 25 countries here with us today in Chicago. We'll have a plenary sessions like the opening here this afternoon, a closing luncheon on Friday. We'll have concurrent discussions, workshops, and night owl sessions. We have a graduate and student cohort with us. We have media fellows from around the world, and we're fortunate to be joined by 20 international knowledge partners and 50 civic organizations in Chicago. We're, of course, especially grateful for our sponsors that have made the 2016 Chicago Forum possible. To our lead sponsors, AbbVie, Jowell, and United Airlines. To our supporting sponsors, Hyatt Hotels Foundation, IBM Corporation, Motorola Solutions, and Walgreens Boots Alliance. We also want to thank the McCormick Foundation for its support, and our business partner, Kirkland & Ellis, as well as Uber, the official ground transportation for the forum. We are grateful to all of you for joining us here at the Field Museum and around the world via our live streams, which can be accessed at chicagoforum.org. All of our panel discussions will be streamed live over the next few days and will be accessible thereafter. We'll also encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter. We're at Chicago Forum, and our hashtag is Global Cities 2016. Indeed, our moderators will not only take questions from the floor, but also through Twitter. Last but not least, we are thrilled once again to be partnering with the Financial Times on this important event. It's a true pleasure to be bringing you this forum with the Financial Times, the world's true global newspaper. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Gillian Tett, the U.S. Managing Editor of the FT, to the stage.
Thank you very much indeed, Ivo Dolder, for that lovely welcome. And on behalf of the Financial Times, as the US Managing Editor, I should say that we are absolutely delighted to be partnering with the Chicago Global Council on this very, very important event. That's not just because we love Chicago here at the FT, although we certainly do, particularly when the weather is like this. And it's not just because we love smart conversation with intelligent people. And looking around at you in the audience, I know there are a lot of people who have a lot of ideas to offer on the future of cities, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say. But we're particularly pleased to be partnering on this event for the second time because we know that cities really matter. We're in the business of stories, news stories, and cities are at the center of almost every single story that the Financial Times writes today. Good stories about amazing economic dynamism, cultural collisions, technological change, exciting political participation, but also very bad stories about terrorism, about pollution, about rising income inequality, about many problems with corporate and political governance. But either way, these stories affect most of our 2 million strong readers around the world, and I should mention that 30% of those are actually in America. America is our biggest market. And they're very important stories. So important that in fact we have a special report coming out tomorrow looking at the future of cities, and we've also made the ft.com website accessible freely to all of you here during the next couple of days. So I look forward to some fantastic conversations in the next couple of days. We have several leading FT journalists who've come in from around the world to moderate these conversations. I look forward to hearing what this amazing array of delegates have to say about these very, very important issues and finding solutions and ways to turn the bad stories about cities into good stories in the future. But most importantly, I would like to first of all say a very big welcome to a man who's probably best placed to start off the whole event, Mayor Emmanuel, who's going to be saying a few words of welcome to kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. Hey, Glenn. I want to thank all of you for being here, especially the guests. As a mayor of the city of Chicago, you'd make me happy if you just go out from here and go spend some money and buy some things. We got a budget we need to meet, so you would be very helpful. On a serious note, I want to thank, this is our second year of having a forum, because I think one of the most dynamic and exciting things happening around the world today is what I would call, at least here in the United States, but you can see it around the world, is the renaissance of our cities as the intellectual, cultural, and economic center of either a metro area or a global area. And the good news for the city of Chicago, in the last 3 years, there have been 3 distinct studies of 100 cities, IBM, Economist Magazine, A.T. Kearney. And in each of the magazines, or each of the studies of 100 global cities, Chicago is ranked in the top 10 cities, either 9th, 8th, or 7th, as most economically competitive. As the mayor, I agree with the one that concluded we were the 7th most competitive in the world. Thank you for a fellow Chicago and competitive middle child right there. It fell in line with something we did in my first year of my first term. I had asked Brookings Institute and McKinsey to come in and do a study to look at Chicago, what are our strengths, what are our challenges, what are our opportunities, and to lay out somewhat of a business plan for the city for the next 10 years. All 3 of the former studies and the Brookings Institute and McKinsey study came back with the same conclusion about the city of Chicago. And we have an economic plan that focuses on talent, transportation, and technology. And by investing in those 3 things and continuing to invest in those 3 things, continue to keep Chicago at the competitive edge that it has as it competes around the globe. And in the first 3 studies, what is also interesting for the city, while we were in the top 10 ranking, we were only city on that top 10 ranking that was not either the respective country's financial or political capital. New York was on the list, obviously Berlin was on the list, London was on the list, Tokyo was on the list. All of them are either political or financial capitals of the country. Chicago, thank God, is neither the political or the financial capital of the country, but we are the heartland of the United States. I happen to think of the city as the most American of American cities. And so the conference we're having today, and I've had some meetings with my colleagues from around the globe, all of us face the same kind of challenges. How to find the resources to invest in the future and make sure that our city continues to be a high quality living experience for people of diverse backgrounds to continue to call that home. And we continue to approach this, and I learn a lot from my colleagues from around the globe who are facing similar challenges but looking for answers. The decisions we make in the next 3 years, the next 4 years, will determine what Chicago will look like in the next 30 or 40 years. And nothing is more important to have this meeting, to have a shared set of ideas, and I do welcome all of you to the city and thank those who have helped make this possible. It is a continual effort for us to keep a dialogue going and learn from each other as we make the decisions about investing in the future. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Ambassador Heng, Chee, Chen, Secretary Henry Paulson, Dame Tessa, Jowell, Governor Sukhumbhand Paribatra, and our panel moderator, Gillian, Tett.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome once again. Welcome to the opening panel of this conference, looking at the future of the powers and limitations of global cities. And in many ways, this picks up where Mayor Emmanuel just left off, because as he says, Chicago recently has been doing an audit of what its strengths and weaknesses are and what it can do to invest to make a more vibrant and successful city in the future. What we're going to be doing in this panel is essentially taking that a step further and saying, well, if you look at global cities around the world as a whole, what does an audit look like today? Are cities working? Are they not working? Which cities would we hold up as being top of the class? What would we put as the most effective global city? Which ones are the disaster zones? Which ones are going to essentially be worthy of praise? Which ones are the problems? And we have, as you just heard, a fantastically diverse collection of people to talk about this. I won't present them all again now, but we have essentially at one end Ambassador Chan, who's representing the city-state of Singapore, arguably one of the most successful cities in the world. We have Secretary Paulson, Heng Paulson, a man known to many of you as former Secretary of Treasury, but who's been working with Chicago and looking at the issue of urban innovation, particularly in relation to US and China for many years. We have Dame Tessa Jowell, who's been working as a British Member of Parliament for many years, but has been very involved in the role of London on the global stage and trying to defend London's interests. And we have Governor Sukhumbhand Paribatra, who is the governor of the city of Bangkok in Thailand, a former academic, political scientist, who spent years analysing problems and has been trying to fix them as governor of Thailand recently. So I'd like to start by asking Ambassador Chan. You've spent many years originally as ambassador to Washington, in fact 14 years as Singapore's ambassador to Washington, looking at Singapore in a global context. And many Americans, many Europeans would look at Singapore today and say, not only are you perhaps one of the most potent city-states in the world, but in some ways you are an extraordinary success story as a city. What do you think are the key lessons for why Singapore works today?
How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
Well, Gillian, I would say, looking at Singapore, it has two advantages. It's a global city, and it is a city-state. We can be small and nimble, but we can also have the authority, the sovereignty, and the financial resources to do things, and that has helped us enormously. Singapore has taken advantage, first, of what its original role has been, which is as a maritime and trading center. Then we piled on other functions, seeking to be relevant, and that's very important for global cities. Are you relevant? Can you remain relevant? And from a maritime and trading center, we've become a financial center, we've become a petrochemical center. We are the third largest petrochemical refining center in the world. And we're an aviation hub. And I think there's a power law about cities. The more you do, the more you will have. More will come. People will come, talent will come, investments will come, etc. So I think we've capitalized on that. But the second point about Singapore is that we were fortunate to start off with an excellent leadership. A leadership which, knowing we have no resources, absolutely no resources, no oil, not even water, chose to be strategic and to develop the human resource, people. And by being strategic, I think my the founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, and his ministers really found a role and constantly tried to define a role for Singapore and to build an excellent bureaucracy, an honest bureaucracy, a disciplined bureaucracy, and we work as a whole of government. Every agency is coordinated. And when you are small, city size, city-state size, you can be coherent, you can have rapid policy response, so it comes together. I say all this, but there are times when we are not so well coordinated.
Remind us, how many people live in Singapore today? What's the
5.5 million.
5.5 million? Well, that makes you a tiddler compared to how many in Bangkok today?
The registered population is 5.7, but I think there are at least 10 to 12 million.
10 to 12 million, right. I mean, when you, as governor of Bangkok, look at Singapore and see the extraordinary success, which, I mean, what strikes me most about Singapore is not just that you are flexible and in some ways homogenous, you're also very holistic. You have very joined up government a lot of time. When you look at a story like Singapore, do you think you can be Singapore? Can you copy Singapore? Or is that just too difficult given all the history?
We are always very jealous of Singapore. Because
well, you win prizes for honesty, straight up.
There's a unity of national and local governance, and this makes one's task much easier. While in Thailand, things are much more complex, different legal, political, social, and financial settings.
And yet Bangkok does have this amazing sense of cultural history. I mean, no one's going to stand up and suddenly sing One Night in Singapore, are they?
I'm not sure whether that's a compliment, but...
Well, I think we can take that as a compliment. Let's be optimistic. Sorry, you're going to tell me that people are going to sing One Night in Singapore.
But Gillian, can I just add this point that I've pointed out what is good about Singapore and all the reasons why Singapore is successful. But our position is not unassailable. A city-state, a global city, can lose its position. Think Venice. When connectivity changes, you change, and technology. So for Singapore, I think it has become our task and role to always define a new relevance. And that is what we are obsessed with, to constantly reinvent ourselves.
Right.
So far, I think we've done okay.
Well, I want to return later to the question about whether being creative and cool, and certainly Bangkok, in many people's eyes, is seen as being creative and pretty cool, whether that actually makes it harder to be organized too, whether you need to have some messy collisions to be cool or not. Because I think when you're talking about innovation, that's a key issue. But on the issue of Venice, I'd like to bring in Dame Jowell and ask you, we at the FT recently ran a series of advertisements about our Brexit coverage, which for those of you who haven't read it yet is super. You should all go and read it. But we had a picture of Venice and London and asking essentially, is London destined to become the new Venice if Brexit happens? I'm not necessarily going to ask you to talk about Brexit, although I'm sure everyone here would love to know whether you think it's going to happen or not. But how do you look at London today as a city, as a quasi-city-state?
Well, I don't think that London is a city-state, and I don't think it would be a good thing for London to become a city-state. London is the foremost city in the United Kingdom, contributes to the economy and the strength of the economy in the United Kingdom, but is clearly distinctive. And I think that, when I was in the plane flying over here today, I was thinking about this, this elusive definition of what is a global city. And a global city is not a world city. It's not just a city. It sort of describes a special kind of personality, of self-confidence, which London certainly has, connectedness to the rest of the world, which London certainly has, woven into the rest of the world. And immigration over generations has created that for London. And, you know, London is, as defined during and after the Olympics, a creative and cool city. But you can't, and the ambassador's absolutely right about this. I mean, there are threats to London's position as we would say, as London is the greatest city in the world. You can be creative and cool, but there's a limit to your creativity and coolness if there are problems with visas and you restrict talent coming in, if you don't have universal broadband coverage, and if young creative people can't afford to live in the city, can't afford to send their children to school there. So the threats facing London are actually rather prosaic. It's the lack of affordable housing. It's the level of congestion, the creaking infrastructure, desperately in need of updating with plans to do so, the skill mismatch, the fact that the constraint on construction at the pace that London needs is the shortage of skilled labour, and so on. So I think that you can see this into, you know, the ambitious, poetic part of the identity, which is a creative city, but also the risks if it becomes disconnected from the means by which that creativity, that leadership is actually sustained.
But when you, as someone who has looked at the governance of London in some detail, actually ran to be mayor, when you were considering your mayoral bid, did you feel jealous when you looked at Singapore and said, well, if only I had a small, cohesive, you know, bureaucracy that I could actually, you know, control, get to do things, that would be the answer? I think there are two things. I mean, one is if you are the mayor of a great city, you transcend traditional tribal politics. That's the first thing. Second, you have to be able to plan for the long term. I mean, if I look, you know, the transformation of Singapore has been over what, 20 years, 30 years?
Oh, 50 years.
50 years, there you are. And, you know, actually meeting the challenges of modernization that London requires will take 20 years. So I think that is, you know, I think it's a mistake to look at other cities and envy because, you know, London is a city of and for Londoners, distinct. And therefore, the way in which London is run and projected to the world has to be true to that. And there are aspects of, you know, the city-state of Singapore that would never work in London. I mean, London is kind of irreverent, self-confident, rather arsey, really, as one might say.
Not sure how you translate arsey into American, but anyway.
That's right, young city. But it's a city with fragility, and I think that you know, looking at those two things means that you can begin to understand the challenges facing London over the next 10 years.
Right. Secretary Paulson, I'd like to bring you in now because you've never actually run a city, but you have run Goldman Sachs, which is probably as wealthy as your average city, and you've also run the US Treasury. So I'm curious, from your experience, having traveled all over the world, which cities do you think are most successful today?
Wow. So I happen to, first of all, I love my city. So I've lived in New York, I've lived in Washington. I came back to live in Chicago. So I'm a big fan of Chicago. Now, number one. Number two, I would say that I agree with the comments that have been made here, how important management is to a city. And I've watched Chicago go up and down based upon the mayors here. You can have, it's harder to screw up a national government than it is a city. Okay, so it's management intensive. I look at it, so I'm gonna look at it from a sort of an unusual perspective because I think basically cities don't work unless there's a strong economic base. If you don't have, and governments don't create jobs, but they create the conditions for business to create jobs. And it's very competitive because business and capital are ultimately going to go where it's most attractive to invest. And so again, I look at it through that focus. And I think Singapore has done a magnificent job. I think London has done a magnificent job. And so to me, they both really stand out. I have, though, my focus, and I'm not, you know, as you say, I can comment having traveled around those places, but because my focus is US-China relations, and on US-China relations, my focus is on economic sustainability and the environment. I look at urbanization through that route. And so one of the biggest things on my mind, huge, is I look at what's going to happen, what Ivo said at the beginning, you know, this population explosion, the next 2 to 3 billion people, where are they going? They're going to the cities. And so the reason I think that London and Singapore are so important and Bangkok is we're going to need models, because most of that growth is going to be in the developing world. And I'll tell you, there are huge issues. And so as China figures out what the urbanization model is going to look with the next 300 million people going to the city, and as they look to models, you know, elsewhere, and as they help create models for the developing world, it's going to be really important. And there, it's going to be just, you know, we're talking about, you know, all the, you know, the arts and what makes different cities special. I think in the developing world, it's going to be management capacity. How do you train the management capacity? The plans. If you don't get the plan right, you're really in problems. And then finance, because many parts of the world, they don't have municipal finance. And when you look at what needs to be done to bring the clean technologies into deal, I'm focused on the environment. And I'll tell you, we can argue about what roles city plays and where the national government plays a bigger role and the city plays a bigger role. But when you look at, you know, dealing with waste material management, you look at dealing with transportation, you look at dealing with buildings, that's at the city. And I'll tell you, if you are as concerned as I am about climate change and the economic risk from that, it's going to be all about what happens in the cities. And so therefore, that's why I think New York is so important. And I'll just tell you, I've got to say a few words about New York. I think New York compares very favorably with London, very favorably with most major. I don't compare.
With Chicago?
Well, I don't, just in terms of overall, in terms of the energy, in terms of the dynamism, in terms of the environment for business, I just look at Singapore in a different way. You know, when the ambassador talked about management, I heard someone the other day ask me, and they said, listen, in 1960, there were 2 island nations that started off each run by a 30-year-old lawyer. And they described one of which was Singapore as being, you know, in a swamp and nothing there. And the other, of course, was Cuba, which had this vibrant economy. And of course, Castro, 30 years old, and Lee Kuan Yew. And of course, look what happened to one and look what happened to the other. And it was through, a lot of that is just through really, really good management.
Right, right. Well, I know that certainly the environmental issues are crucial. I mean, one of the things that Secretary Paulson is involved with, for years if you don't know, is trying to bring green technologies to China. And one of the facts that leapt out of me from our recent conversations is that an astonishingly high proportion of emissions around the world come from construction, come from the creation of cities in places like China, which of course is a key issue. But I was going to turn to Governor Paribatra in a minute, but do you want to jump in here for a second? And then
I just wanted to throw into the ring this thought. You know, Peter Schwartz, this scenario builder, says that by 2065, 80% of the world will be urban. And Professor Michael Batty, this very well-known British geographer, said by the end of the century, the whole world will be urban. Now, the rural countryside will be urban. And you have second-tier cities, third-tier cities, fourth-tier cities. You are bringing urban functions to the rural areas. Does that help or does not help in greening, in greenhouse gases, etc.?
Well, let me say this, whether it helps or hurts, it's a fact. And so, and a big part of this is going to be having cities be livable. Cities that are livable for people, you know, made for people and not just cars. But my own view is that, just taking China as an example and building on what Gillian said, you know, that roughly, you know, 40% of carbon emissions come from buildings. Over the last 5 years, perhaps half of all new buildings have gone up in China. So you say, where will the big benefits come from? They'll come from, a lot of them, from energy efficiency. And I think if it's done right, and there you're talking about transportation, you're talking about energy efficient buildings, you're talking about industrial processes, that's where a lot of the low-hanging fruit is. But so much of this is about rolling out new clean technologies in scale on a cost-effective basis in the developing world. And where's the money going to come from? It's not going to come from government. Government's going to have to create the conditions to bring that private capital there. So again, there's a lot to be learned from what we see, experiments and things that are going on in cities all around the world. And for instance, in China, the reason my institute is a think and do tank, and we're focused right now, I'm focused on two things in particular. One of which is this Jingjiangji region, which is Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei, which is the political center of China. It's huge in terms of the population. So it's a big population center, big industrialization, very dirty air, but yet China is focusing on this as to be the pilot for rolling out their transformation to a lower carbon economy and to a new economy. And so the work that they're doing there, and part of it is energy efficiency, part of it is transportation, part of it is getting renewables on the grid, but that, and then another thing we're working on is green finance, because that China is president of the G20 this year,
right,
and they're working on models for green finance. And the reason I think it's so important is those models might be not only very, very important in China, but could be used throughout the developing world.
So we need innovative technology and innovative sorts of finance as well. But I'm curious, okay.
But what I think we're at risk of forgetting here is the dynamic that drives this, because we certainly, I mean, I think that, you know, we all agree that that strong and directed management is fundamental to change. But that certainly in the UK, most of Europe, most of the US, is cut across by the messy business of politics, which so often means that you know, decisions on big infrastructure projects are crying out to be taken, but they become paralyzed by the inability to broker a political agreement, a political consensus. And so I think that we can be highly prescriptive about what cities need, but let's remember, also don't let's forget that you're having to broker two things. Drive the management process to secure change, but also look after the politics at the same time.
So how do we cope with democracy in a city?
Oh, well, there you are.
It's an issue which certainly Chicago's grappling with. But I'd just like to bring in Governor Paribatra right now and say, you know, you are in many ways emblematic of the problem in the emerging markets, in that you say you officially have 5 million people. It's probably nearer to 10 million. that reflects a boom in urbanization, which is quite dramatic. As you say, on current projections, 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities by 2050. And if you extrapolate from the chart, you end up with everyone living in cities soon. How on earth do you in Bangkok cope with this sudden expansion? I mean, do you have the ability to execute decisions quickly, or are you being upended by messy politics too? Could you copy what Secretary Paulson is talking about with green technology?
For a long, long time, Bangkok flourished despite itself. For a long time, we expanded, our economy expanded without proper city planning, with very little legal power given to the city. But 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago, a new law was passed, and I think we began to put things right. And yes, in many ways, we have been able to address many of the challenges that have arisen over the last 30 years, and the challenges which we inherited from the period before that. We perhaps have benefited from relative continuity. In the 30 years since that law was passed, there have been only 6 governors, while there have been over 20 changes of government. So
you've had 20 national leaders.
No, 14
only 14.
different, but
14, they've changed 20 times,
yes.
and you've only changed 7 times.
Yes.
Okay, well, you're certainly more
so
stable
there's
then.
more continuity.
That makes Italian politics look positively stable, but yes.
but still, we need to amend the law because the world has changed. We need to, more capacity, legal capacity to deal with more problems. And introducing green technology is difficult if we require great investment. But we're trying our best. But budgetary constraint is a big constraint. Bangkok pays 70% of the nation's taxes, but we get from the government less than 0.7 of the national budget.
0.7?
0.7. And
that sounds like a very bad deal.
In absolute terms, in the last 20 years, the national budget has gone up probably 4 times, nearly 4 times, while in absolute terms, the money we get from the government remains exactly the same.
So my question is, imagine tomorrow you said, okay, I'm governor of Bangkok, I want to deal with the environmental problem. Could you, in theory, talk to Secretary Paulson or talk to other people and just develop a scheme to get green finance and implement it? Do you have that power? Or are messy local politics getting in your way? Is democracy the problem? Or is it the problem that actually the national government is impeding what you want to do?
We are allowed to talk to different people. We're allowed to engage in agreements. I don't engage in tribal politics, as Jowell has mentioned. And I have had to work with 3 different governments in the last 7 years. And I think on the whole, they have been pretty reasonable over the years. So yes, we can go our own way in this sort of things. Indeed, we were more progressive than the government because we introduced the first carbon emission reduction plan by a government agency. The first plan started in 2007, and now we are starting the second plan, which is a 20-year plan. So right. we can go ahead. We can go ahead.
So that's probably a model in London as well, and right.
Yeah. And you see, some of these policies will have will be initiated and have their origin at a very local level. A sort of community level. Some will be determined by the national government, and the city government then becomes the mediator and the implementer. It seems to me that the important thing is to be pretty focused on the small number of policies that can be transformational and that you, as a city government, have the power to deliver.
Right. Secretary Paulson?
Yeah, I would just echo what has just been said, in that I think the issues everywhere I look are political. And it's not just in democracies. That, using the U.S. Make two comments. First of all, your comment about infrastructure. In the U.S., we all know we need massive investment in infrastructure. And again, it's not, the government, I don't think, has got the money to do everything that needs to be done. And how do you attract private capital? And the issues we have are all the multiple regulations and delays and political risk that makes it an unattractive investment. And so it's very hard. You talk about building high-speed rail, you talk about building the kind of power grid we should have in the United States, and you look at all the right-of-ways and environmental laws. Now I'm going to go to China, because some people say, well, they're an authoritarian government. They will say to me, I call it the ask the emperor syndrome. People will say, well, the president, Xi Jinping, why don't you just ask him, and boy, he can get something done. And you look at the diffuse decision-making in China, and you look at the power that has been devolved to cities on the one hand, but on the other, cities don't really have a sustainable system of municipal finance in China. And mayors don't have real budget authority. They have to take someone's land and go to it and use it to, finance investment in infrastructure. And that's not sustainable. And they need massive tax reform, major tax reform. And that's very difficult to get done politically in China. And so there are all sorts of issues that they don't have the national government bureaucracy they need. And so the president is trying to modernize the government and grow that. They don't have a legal system to enforce the environmental laws.
Yeah.
So they need to start using environmental measures to assess mayors in terms of their job performance. But so there's everywhere I look, I think these issues are issues of management capacity, but also political issues. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that need to be done are politically unpopular.
Except, of course, in Singapore, which has this very holistic model where, essentially it is small enough to be run as a single bureaucracy because of the city-state.
And there's something to be said about continuity of government, I would like to pick up the point also about everything being political, and mayors don't have enough resources, they may not have the power. And I'm not sure the answer is to give mayors that much more power, because it's a problem in a country. If there are 10 cities doing very well and you enhance the power of every mayor, you're going to have 10 warlords before you know it. And it fragments the country. So I can see the center jealously guarding some of that power. But I have to say that mayors have demonstrated they learn from each other, and the C40 mayors have done a very good job of learning from each other, inspiring each other.
And mayors, I'll tell you this, mayors in the U.S. have a lot of power.
Yes.
And they get things done. And it's really, I think, one of the strongest parts about the U.S. system, with the exception of the way some of the fiscal affairs have been run in some of our cities. But other than that, which is a big other than.
Well, as someone who's gone around the country quite a bit, I can say, spending time in Washington usually leaves me feeling like I want to jump off the nearest tall building. Spending time looking at what's happening in some of the local areas, the municipal regions of cities, is wildly inspiring, because you have these Petri dish experiments all over America, which are actually showing different ways of having governance. But I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a minute. But before I do, the question that rises in my mind from hearing you talk and hearing about the fact that mayors can sometimes get things done more effectively than national governments, or they're more stable than national governments, is should we be actually asking cities to play a bigger role on the global stage? Should cities be essentially involved in setting foreign policy or trying to almost circumvent the national governments to create connections? Because I think certainly in London right now, there's quite a lot of people in London who would like to succeed if there was Brexit and create their own city-state. But, I mean, is it time to be talking about cities as an agent of foreign policy?
I just say make one view as someone not carrying water on one side or the other. There are different systems, and in some, there's different forms of federalism, there are different political systems, and to me, the point though that is overwhelming is cities are where the action is going to take place. So there's a huge role, whether mayors like it or not, there's a huge role just in managing cities. And in almost every city I can think of, there's a huge role in terms of the environment, okay? And there's no doubt that they do that. There's a huge role in terms of making the city competitive and open for business. And so again, we could argue about whether we should give cities more power or not. I'm really much more focused on how do you create the models, because I'll tell you, that's where so much of the action is going to take place. And even if the policies are set at the national level, they're going to be implemented in many cases at the city. And that's where, that's the coalface. That's where you're really, whether you're dealing with crime, preventing terrorism, whether you're dealing with education, which is just almost, education, the training, businesses working with cities to train. So I just see this as being huge, and again, come back to cities needing to create models.
Right. I think this question about, should cities be free to develop a foreign policy, really, it kind of forgets the order, which is that there are certain functions that a national government has to discharge. And I think that I'm sure that London, the city I know best in the world, you could certainly argue the case and describe London's foreign policy, which is by and large pro-European, outward-looking, pro-immigration, and in favor of utilizing the links with countries like India, like parts of South America, China, the city having a large diaspora, quite apart from anything else. So I think that's fine, but I think it's very important not to forget that the electorate, and mayors are elected, the electorate will judge the success of a mayor by his or her ability to do what they need for their city. So you can have a very grandiose foreign policy and lose an election if you haven't built the homes that people need and improve the quality of the infrastructure. So again, you come back to this. It's a slightly Mario Cuomo-ish, isn't it? That you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And there has to be that underpinning of practical and very clearly managed change.
You see, on that note, do you think, for example, somebody like Sadiq Khan, the new mayor of London, was correct to come out and say that we should stay in the European Union? Is that the role of a mayor of London?
Absolutely, and I think he was because it's in London's interest to remain as part of the European Union. And look at the businesses in London who speak with virtually one voice on the importance of European investment in London. And he was absolutely right to share a platform with the Prime Minister in doing that, because this is an issue which is a matter of national concern, not one of narrower party politics.
Would you go out and be an ambassador for Thailand, not just Bangkok?
City CEOs, there's a strong trend of city CEOs becoming national leaders or heads of government. But while they remain city CEOs, there is very little time to engage in international diplomacy. Most mayors or governors find it difficult to travel. As I'm sitting here in Chicago, if there's a heavy downpour in Bangkok, people will start asking, where's the governor? Why isn't he here trying to drain some water from some streets?
Okay, so we're watching the weather forecast very closely in Bangkok.
It doesn't mean that we don't engage in any diplomacy at all, but it is, we have built good relationships with different cities. But that's one thing. It's a totally different thing to engage on purpose international diplomacy on a sustained basis.
Right. Ambassador Chan.
Yes, last word on this, if I may. I fully agree with everything that has just been said, but I would say that mayors do conduct some kind of diplomacy. They do it for trade missions. And I know when Governor Bill Clinton was governor, he went with mayors to Taiwan. I know Jacques Chirac, when he was mayor of Paris, went to Japan quite a few times, So I think they try to get investments and so on. To some extent, it is foreign policy, but not foreign policy the way it touches on security and grand strategy. But as an ambassador in Washington, I was quite intrigued to find Tacoma Park, in fact, imposed sanctions on Myanmar, way above what the United States was imposing. And I think Boston as well. And I remember looking...
national cities like Boston were imposing more sanctions on Myanmar than the federal government.
And Tacoma Park in Maryland.
I'm not sure how big the Tacoma Park links are with Myanmar.
Surprised, because Myanmar is in ASEAN, so I was naturally interested. And I was quite intrigued, how could this be? But there you are,
Well, that's all part of the federal spirit of America and the diversity.
I'll tell you one thing you see, not only are you right, but it's becoming much, much more intense. With globalization and with capital being as mobile as it is, it's amazing how competitive where businesses are looking that they're going to build. Mayors and governors that's a big part of their job, and it's becoming I think more intense and more difficult. And so you'll find mayors fighting and promoting and to bring business, or being big protectionists, trying to protect dying industries.
Yeah. I mean, just on that note, I've got to quickly ask you, Tessa, Jowell, before I turn to the audience for questions. If the UK does vote for Brexit, does London lose its global perch?
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen, Gillian.
What's your betting? What are your betting odds?
I think Brexit would be damaging to London's economy. Yes.
And what's your probability? What probability do you give of Brexit right now? What probability do you give to Brexit right now?
I think that we'll vote to remain. But the important thing is that we vote to remain conclusively, so the issue is settled, certainly for the next generation.
Well, I think if Secretary Paulson had a vote, I certainly know which way he'd be voting.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with what you said, because business, one of the things, London is a center for global business. It's a global financial center. It is, and so that, to me, a no vote would be devastating, and I don't think it'll happen. Yeah. And
well, I hope you're right. But many political predictions have been upended this year.
You're right. And mine is worth absolutely nothing. I'm just an optimist.
Yeah. Well, let's have some questions from the audience. It would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself if you wish to ask a question. It would also be courteous to keep your question very, very short. I believe we have some microphones roving in the audience. And if you wish to direct it to an individual person, do let me know. If not, I will direct it myself. So, any questions for our panel? We have a question back there.
Antonio Sampaio from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I've heard very interesting things about global north, developed world cities. I'd like to know where do, global cities from developing countries, especially those cities that are facing profound violence and dysfunction, such as Rio de Janeiro. I come from Rio and I live in London, and it's very different. I mean, they aspire to be global cities, and they're certainly seen as global cities, as the introductory video showed. So how can they be global cities even though they're facing, high-level violence, criminal violence, and several, deep problems that don't affect cities like Chicago and New York?
You don't see violence in Chicago?
I was going to say, yeah, I think tragically, given what's happened so far this year, that's not. Well, Secretary Paulson, would you like to comment on this issue of how do you combat the violence, and can you be a true global city if you are?
Listen, I'm not. I think my comment aside, I think people, the violence in Chicago, which is very sad. It's not in the areas where business is operating, and it hasn't really affected yet the competitiveness here. But it's a huge problem. Now, do I think global, in developing world, that there will be true global cities there? And the answer is you betcha. That when you look, so step back a minute, and those of us who've been raised in the developing world, the world is changing in the sense when you look at where the economic growth is coming from, and you look at the OECD countries and the percentage of the global economy they had 10 or 20 years ago and what they've got now and what they're going to have in the future, it is the economic weight is going to be shifting to Asia and to other parts of the developing world. And so the idea that people think that Shanghai or the Jing-Jin-Ji region or Beijing or Chengdu aren't going to be, right along with Hong Kong, outstanding global cities, I think are don't understand what's happening. So I think they've got it real. If they get it right, they will be important economic drivers, but for them to get it right, China is going to need a new economic model.
Right.
And they are going to need, they're not dealing with crime there, they're dealing with, terrible pollution issues. And they're dealing with other really serious issues in terms of dealing with their own form of immigration, in terms of the immigration from people from the countryside without having access to education and healthcare. But yes, I think that and I think your question, though, when you look at Latin America and you look at different places in Africa and you look at what's going to happen throughout the developing world, and cities springing up and becoming 3, 4, 5 million population cities overnight, this is something we all have to be very cognizant of, because if they don't deal with these issues, it's going to impact not only them, but all of us in terms of what it does to our global ecosystem and what it does to our global economy.
Right. Yeah. Tessa.
I think this is such a good and important question. And I think my reaction is on 3 levels. First of all, cities don't become global cities simply by asserting that they are global cities. I think the second is that the fear of crime, neighborhoods where crime is a fact of everyday life, and I've represented in my years as a member of parliament some such neighborhoods, makes this sort of self-confidence, outward-looking self-confidence that comes with being a global city almost impossible, which is why mayors that make tackling crime, bringing down crime, their number one priority, are likely to be successful in transforming their cities. And I think the third thing I'd say with the Rio Olympics, 35 days away, is that, I greatly respected the ambition of the International Olympic Committee, and I know we're going to be talking about big events over the mega events over the course of the conference and the part that they have to play. And I'm sure that the Rio Olympics will be a huge success, but obviously they haven't come without a price in disruption, unrest, and so forth by the local community who are living with this, the uncertainty, crime, disruption to their lives day by day. So I think that you've absolutely, if you like, sort of registered a question at the heart of what we mean by global cities and what we have to do, what leadership is required in order to create a global city.
Yes. We have a very different question from the electronic connection. Sultan Al-Qasimi has tweeted, what role does naturalization of immigrants play in Singapore? That's a question which, of course, has implications for immigrant policy in many cities around the world. Ambassador Chan, would you like to comment on what role the naturalization of immigrants plays in Singapore?
Singapore is a very open society. In fact, we were so open about, increasing our population through immigration. And our immigration is not rural country. It's not migration from the rural country to the city. We actually give visas so you can control your immigration. And we've been very good about opening our doors because Singaporeans are not reproducing themselves, 1.2. That's our birth rate, So in fact, in Singapore today, 1 out of every 4 that you meet on the street is not a Singaporean, it's a foreigner. In fact, it could be 1.3 something. Now, you can be naturalized to be a citizen. And, but like most cities elsewhere, we are also receiving some political backlash from too many immigrants. So whilst we remain open, we are staggering that openness. In other words, you're controlling it. But it's hugely important. Immigrants play a very productive role in our society and helps Singapore prosper. They play really constructive roles.
Well, it helps maintain the population, as you say, in a world where
yes, certainly.
Many Singaporeans are not having babies. So, yeah, problem of much of Western Europe. Any more questions from the audience? We have a question down there, front. We've just got a few more minutes.
Hi. Steve Clemens of The Atlantic. Thank you very much. My question is, none of you from the various cities you basically represent are talking about the transformational power that we're seeing in things like data, sensors. Rahm Emanuel is one of the most famous data mayors in the world. And while I know there's a panel that comes up on this later, it just seems to me so core to talking about and framing the power and limits of future cities that I'm interested in how you think about data and how that is changing what's possible in the cities that you're representing.
I think everyone here, Steve, will say that, that's Steve Clemens from The Atlantic. Everyone on this panel will say that data, of course, plays a very major role, and how we use data in urban informatics to help in city management is going to be crucial in actually managing the problems of the city. But clearly not every city is at that level. But at the very least, I would say, in fact, when I think of connectivity and global cities thrive on connectivity. Because of the connectivity, a city is a global city. And that connectivity must now move to a sort of digital connectivity. The digital footprint of influence is extremely important. I'm sorry we didn't mention it.
I'd like to ask Governor Paribatra, how do you use data in Bangkok? I mean, do you have an opportunity to do that, or is that something that...
Well, we are developing our database, which will assist us in tax collection and also assist us in other areas like provision of public health services and looking after the elderly. So, but it is very much still work in progress. But the importance of data is recognized.
I think the use of data also allows an open conversation between the leadership of a city and the people of the city, which is why it is important that the data is trusted. The second thing is that transformational change doesn't come without inconvenience and asking people to behave differently, to take their car less often, to take the bus more, to walk more, all these kinds of things. And I think that data can be a very powerful mediator in providing the evidence base on which that behavior change is carried.
Right.
I tell you what's been a huge eye-opener for me. The Paulson Institute sponsors a U.S.-China CEO Council on Sustainable Urbanization. And so there we have really big companies like Tim Cook from Apple, Doug McMillan from Walmart, Ginny Rometty from IBM, Mary Barra from General Motors, and then on the Chinese side, the State Grid, Alibaba, and so on. And the project's big data, like for instance, it's just blown me away in terms of looking, for instance, at what IBM is doing in China, helping them track and be able to predict the pollution and source where it's coming from, or what can be done in terms of transportation management, or and all of these companies, it's the technology they bring. And the technology I see in China, and just in terms of even managing the power on the grid. So this is bringing all kinds of capabilities. And so I think that is a huge tool for mayors. But still, I do think no matter how much of a tool that is, so much of the constraints come down to political constraints, getting support from the voters to do the things and to do really, really difficult things. But you're right on. But I think probably the reason we didn't address it is none of us, I can look at it with awe, but in terms of getting me to, I'm not a big data expert.
Well, as Secretary Paulson says, there's always a problem of those pesky politics, or these pesky politicians. But it's been a terrific debate. Thank you very much indeed. As Steve just said, over the next couple of days, we'll be picking up many of these themes and discussing them in a lot more detail, whether it's to do with data management, whether it's to do with the issue of the Olympics or other big events and how they impact on economies. We have a session on violence, which is a very big issue, tragically, even in Chicago. We have an issue on income inequality, on urban design, an event on income inequality, and we also got events looking at questions of culture. So a whole range of these specific themes will be discussed. But to me, perhaps one of the most potent comments of this session, which I think framed it all, was actually from Secretary Paulson saying, it's harder to screw up national government than to screw up a city. To which I would add, it's probably easier to make your mark quickly and do something really dynamic for the future in a city than government too.
Amen. Yeah.
Amen. And that is what we're all here to discuss. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And next up, we're all going to have a drink.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Please proceed to Stanley Field Hall for a reception followed by the dinner. There will be staff to direct you along the way. Thank you.